Please have a seat, come to front, and we will start soon with the introduction of our keynote of today. Ladies and gentlemen, dear FEPSAC family, please can I have your attention to introduce Tadhg McIntyre from Maynooth University in Ireland. I'm the past president, Markus Raab, and I'm very happy that the president and many managing council members are in front. And as you can already see, Tadhg will talk about environmental factors in sport and exercise psychology and an emerging nature-based paradigm. Tadhg is certainly one of the founders of an area called green exercise, and he follows a good tradition in psychology to look at both the environment and the person to explain human behavior. Tadhg is the coordinator of a Horizon 2020 Go Green Roots project, and he will talk about that today for our health, our well-being in changing environments. Some background to Tadhg. He's born 1970. Was I allowed to say that? I hope. He did his bachelor and master in psychology in Dublin. He has his PhD in Dublin on motor cognition in action. He was affiliated with West Virginia University in the US. And now for many years, he's at Maynooth University, a member of the institute called Assisted Living and Learning. For those who love numbers, his last grant in Horizon 2020 reached 10 million euro as a grant. His age index is 28. He has some 8 editor roles. One is associate editor in IRSIP, the International Review of Sport and Exercise Psychology. My favorite paper, Tadhg, is the one from 2021 in the International Review of Sport and Exercise Psychology. It's From Simulation to Motor Execution, a topic he already started in his master, and Adrian Morin was very informative for that. More important than numbers, Tadhg is really a great person, supporting our field, founding green exercise, supervising young researchers, and enjoys good social company. Tadhg, we are very much looking forward to your presentation. It will be eye-opening. Thanks, Tadhg. Please come to the front.
Thank you so much to Markus, to Maurizio, to members of the FEPSAC Council. So it's my honor to be here in this amazing venue. And rumors that the horse was a present from Maurizio are entirely unfounded. So what I'd like to do is just establish where I'm coming from. You won't see any images of Maynooth University's award-winning green campus. You won't see images of our Edwardian orchard, nor our 700-year-old trees. But I will tell you a short anecdote. So, about 40 years ago, I was a young athlete. Many of you have experience in sport, which I've heard about previously. And as a young athlete, I was a naive competitor, as we all are, at age 12. I was looking at the start of a canoe slalom event, which is like ski slalom except with the added risk of drowning. And I focused and stared at gate 1. This was my task. About 10 years later, in Italy, on the river Passer in the city of Merano, I was on a start line for an Olympic qualifier race, and there I looked beyond gate 1. So I conceived the line I would take to the first sequence of whitewater gates. Another 10 years later, I was back on the same river, about 250 kilometers from here. It's beautiful alpine whitewater and much cooler than here. And instead of thinking about the race, as the countdown clock would tell me 30 seconds, 10 seconds to go, I would look around and take in the beautiful natural scenery. So what was that progression? It was progression from novice to experienced, perhaps to expert, when we're not so controlled or concerned with our task at hand because we trust our skills. And instead, you invest your effort in self-regulation. So that was my nature story. I'll tell you a little bit more about nature stories today, and also you're welcome to come on our workshop tomorrow to tell your own nature story. So what I'm going to do is use this backdrop of the Botanic Gardens here in the city to take you on a journey today. It could be around 50 minutes, so take out your phones, do tweet or take images, but hopefully my words will keep your attention. And what I'd like to talk about are a couple of key issues. So I want you to understand what's the role of nature in our lives for citizens outside of sport? What is the consequence of human-nature interaction? And also, what are the risks? I'd also like to address how a walk in the park, an American phrase that many of you know, means that something is very easy, can also be very beneficial to you, to the environment, and also with additional benefits for sustainability. We're going to briefly look at the concept of nature as a co-therapist. For some of you, the concept of co-therapist might be quite radical, but I know for others in the room, having nature both as a backdrop to what you do and as part of the foreground in a client intervention is something you're very aware of. And then finally, I'll look at how we as a field, and FEPSAC, I think its response to COVID, its mission is being so ambitious for the field, this is the appropriate forum to share ideas on what we can do in terms of research, in terms of action, and in terms of next steps. So let's begin our journey. So a number of years ago, we wrote a paper, Donnelly et al. In 2016, a precursor to a book on green and blue exercise. And green and blue exercise is simply physical activity in natural settings. But many of us came from an elite sport end, so we were working with Olympic athletes, Olympic squads, or I worked in professional rugby. And we were concerned with the environments in which athletes have to compete. And maybe just put your hand up if you've ever been inside like a call room or a weight area at a competition. So just put your hand up if you've been in a call room or waiting area. So you'll know that these areas are very much absent of nature and virtually anything, often including toilets. So these areas are not designed really with the athlete's best interests at heart. They're very functional. And we were concerned with the overall environmental setting for Olympic Games, which occurs in cities which typically are mega cities like Tokyo or Paris or Los Angeles, which have many competing environmental hazards. So by virtue of their size, they expose people to many threats to their health. And this is how we choose cities. We choose cities of a certain mass and scale to meet the needs of hosting a Games. So you can understand where the problem comes from. But at the same time, one of the pillars of Olympism is sustainability. So this gave us something to reflect on. So in that paper, we explored the past number of Olympic Games, those that had major milestones and posed major threats to athletes. So if we have a look at these here, these games, you can see Mexico, 1968. A major impetus for sports science. Athletes were going to compete at altitude. It's before my time, but Bob Beamon would have set the long jump world record there at altitude, and the thin air would have facilitated that performance. But being at 2,250 meters posed many challenges to endurance sports and across many other activities. So altitude was the problem there. If we step forward to Los Angeles, where as an Irish person, we watched our former elite marathon runner, John Tracy, run an accomplished race to win a silver, has other athletes almost drop like flies in the incessant heat of LA. So Los Angeles had air pollution issues, had heat issues. And we go a step further, we go to Beijing. And Beijing, air pollution was ranked second worst in the world. I think Ulaanbaatar was the worst at the time. And there, to protect athletes from the hazards of environment, what they did is they used an odd and even car plate number mitigation scheme. So odd numbers could only go in on every second day, and even numbers on the other days. So they also shut down many factories to try reduce the ambient air pollution. And this was successful in reducing this threat. So when presented with these co-hazards, cities are able to respond. If we go forward to Rio 2016, air pollution and heat were both seen to be major issues. Heat did prove to be a substantive issue for many athletes. Air pollution was problematic, but the wind at the time mitigated against some of the extreme air pollution events. So these air pollution events, just to explain, they involve particulate matter, which is really small, 2.5 microns. And this can pass even the blood-brain barrier and get into our lungs and provide major negative health consequences, both in the short term and in the long term. And if we flip forward to Tokyo, we know actually in Tokyo, they actually had more mitigation measures. So we know in Tokyo, the marathon was moved from the capital city to Sapporo. And Sapporo in the island of Hokkaido is much cooler than Tokyo. And they also changed the time of the events, even there, to reduce the impact of heat stress on athletes. So if you've worked in a multidisciplinary team in the last number of Olympiads, I'm not suggesting anyone here was working in Mexico, you'll be aware there was a major focus on overcoming environmental hazards. And that has been our Olympic story about the environment. However, there is an alternative view. There's another way to view the problem, what we term beyond toxicity. So let's not look at the environment in terms of hazards and co-hazards. Let's look at the environment as being something which could facilitate performance, recovery, rehabilitation, and even our practice. And that's a different story, and that's one I'm going to share with you. So where that story takes us is to the project which I'm scientific coordinator of. And that just means I have 40 partner organizations, which is more contacts than I have Facebook friends. So it's a little challenging. Today is a brief respite from that challenge, and I'm doubly glad to be here. But in our project, we're trying to promote health across 6 European cities using different interventions. Among the interventions we use are nature-based interventions, which you'll hear more about, and something called nature-based solutions, which an example would be developing linear parks, re-greening a city to meet the demands of a particular problem: air pollution, urban heat island effect, noise pollution, and to facilitate sustainable physical activity among citizens in these 6 cities, which then can be replicated across many European cities. One of the major findings of our project so far was really interesting. It was by partners in Barcelona, led by PhD candidate Evelisa Pereira Barbosa. And in her health impact assessment, they looked to satellite imagery and modeling the impact of giving European citizens in almost 1,000 cities adequate access to green space. So a number of years ago, the WHO clearly articulated that in a guideline that all citizens should be able to access 0.5 of a hectare within 300 meters or 5 minutes walk from their house. So this access to green space is actually built into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, UN SDG Target 11.7, which is about inclusive access for all to green space. What is most telling about the work of Evelisa and the team is that they estimated 43,000, I'll just say it again, 43,000 lives could be saved annually if cities met this standard of access to green space. And that should give us pause for thought. So why is that? Because during COVID times, we saw inequitable access to green space. We saw that this had detrimental impacts upon health, especially during the lockdown scenarios. It also tells us that there are solvable problems, and this is one of the solvable problems we have. We can provide access to green space in many European cities, and one area which they didn't quite test is the quality of that green space in terms of biodiversity, in terms of affordances for play, for physical activity, for social interaction, in what the European Commission happily terms something called an urban living room. I'd love to have an urban living room, providing the temperature is just right. So this is really informative. What it tells us is that green space and a natural environment is important for our health. And that's probably the first lesson for you today. World Economic Foundation then created a video based on our research, which has received a lot of coverage worldwide. So there's a lesson there in doing this type of research in terms of translation of findings into practice, because we now have more evidence to support the recommendation for cities to have green space. So if we take that a step further, where does that bring us? Well, nature and health are not entirely unrelated. So how is that relationship defined? Well, it's very complex, and shortly I'll give you a hint at the complexity. But suffice to say, recent reviews in 2017 by Frumkin, in 2019 by Bratman et al. Show that access to nature and human-nature interactions at different levels for different groups lead to cognitive, mental health, and physical health benefits. And these benefits range from things like skin microbiome biodiversity, enhancing mental health and well-being and immunity amongst the young. They relate to areas of nature having better levels of air quality, natural soundscape, and other cues which can help us think differently. In fact, on a new project proposal we're working on for stage 2 horizon, so we're in the final cut, we're looking at the psychological processes involved in that. And I can't give too much away, but suffice to say, one of the processes is mind wandering. And mind wandering is really interesting because only a decade ago, clinical researchers often looked at this in terms of pathology. So lack of capacity to regulate your thinking through the prefrontal cortex, for example. Now we know that mind wandering, as I discovered on a start line approximately 20 years ago in canoeing, can be a very effective means of self-regulation and psychological recovery. One of the challenges about this field is the complexity. I'll give you one hint. So in one of our studies, one of the lead researchers said, we want to recruit people for the study, but we have to take the word green out of the recruitment pack because we can't give people a hint of what we're doing, because then they'll know what our intention and hypothesis is. Well, simply they can generally read the information sheet, Google the study, find out more about it. But the design of our studies have to be much more sophisticated to overcome perhaps a Google by our participants. And there are many ways to do that. One would be to look at their pre-existing preferences and beliefs. Elliot Flowers, a researcher in green exercise, developed inventories to look at beliefs around green exercise and what impact that could have in terms of placebo, for example. So there are methodological possibilities here. Psychophysiological monitoring is another way to do this. Heart rate variability is often measured in many studies around human-nature interaction. But just to highlight that this is a field from environmental psychology, an area which is approximately 50 years old since the first major journal was started, Journal of Environmental Psychology, which is probably not as integrated as sports psychology. Evidence for that is the high citation numbers and impact across disciplines that PSE and ERSEP, for example, get. That's because our work is being read outside of our field. In environmental psychology, the dominant hypothesis is called the biophilia hypothesis. It simply suggests that interacting and connecting with nature is an innate need. And if somebody gives me such a definition, I will look, as my mentor Aidan Moran did, very critically upon it. And they came up with two theories, which I would boldly suggest are more descriptive than explanatory, called stress reduction theory and attention restoration theory. So through their name, you can guess what their prediction is around contact with nature. Decreased stress and restoration of attention, or enhanced cognition. This doesn't capture the whole story. We know from other disciplines, for example, in occupational and work psychology, that there are well-developed models around stress and recovery. For example, Tadhg's stress detachment model is one such approach. And similar to the work of Michael Kalman, they propose specific pathways for recovery. One of the roles for recovery is detachment. And what's really interesting is right now in our field, the recent work of Eccles this year highlights that recovery is the unsaid aspect of sport performance in terms of psychological recovery. So we might prescribe different types of interventions for athletes to gain physiological recovery, but we don't quite foresee there are sometimes unintended consequences from that. It could be boredom, it could be further stress or competition. And when I worked in professional sport, I often saw this. The recovery sessions would become more competitive than the on-pitch training. And that actually isn't the role of recovery. So arguably, we should look outside, for example, environmental psychology, to try find theories which give us more testable hypotheses. And where would we take those hypotheses? As you'll see, I will suggest we take them to the realm of sport and exercise, because that's where we have a pressing need around well-being, around mental health, around self-care for practitioners, for athletes, and for coaches. There's one other element in the mix. So if you're presented with a tree, and you may, if you look around the room, spot the most elegant illustration of, I have to be careful saying this as an Irish person, 3 trees, which is up here on the wall. It's beautiful. And they're so elegant and balanced, and it's just a beautiful harmonic triadic setting. And these trees, they give an insight into how trees work. So trees work by giving us something we perceive as a gestalt, so we see it as a whole. And as a result, it requires less mental workload than looking, for example, at a building or looking at an artificial or man-made environment. So trees, by their structure, gives us fractal patterns which reduce essentially blood flow to the occipital lobe, because the type of processing required is not the same as it would be if we're looking at the built environment. But that's only half the story. Our childhood exposure to nature, our holidays, our weekend time, getting dirt under our fingernails as kids, that exposure to nature is part of a relationship. We term that relationship nature connectedness. And that's very much at the core of human-nature interaction. So it's not unusual for a psychologist to argue that prior experience of a stimulus and the relationship you have fostered over time has consequences for later behavior. And it's really interesting because some researchers even use the word attachment to explain our relationship with nature, and others, because of their theoretical views, use words like connectedness or affinity. As you can see, the semantics are quite different. But our connectedness with nature is really important, and Capaldi showed in a meta-analytic finding that it's strongly linked to perceived happiness and psychological well-being. But how do you foster nature connectedness? What really is nature connectedness? What is it in the urban scenario? And if I can ask you, how many of you sought out a park, green space, or a blue setting beside the river since you arrived here? Just put your hands up if you have. Super, I'm preaching to the converted. Thank you very much. So this concept of nature connectedness is really interesting, because if it's more state-like than trait, then we can foster it, cultivate it, and give people strengths. Use a strength-based approach to enhance people's capacity to self-regulate through nature. So nature can become part of a toolkit for us and for athletes and coaches. So this is something close to my heart. Nature-based interventions are the way, as psychologists, we view this whole domain. So the interventions are when we're specifically targeting an outcome, either mental health, cognition, resilience, social cohesion, for example. So in a review a number of years ago on mental health in the workplace, Susan Gritzke, one of the team behind Go Green Roots Horizon project, conducted a review, and by and large, the effects were positive, despite many methodological issues in the extant literature. Where the research wasn't so clear was on what would be called the psychophysiological responses. Studies that use salivary cortisol, studies that used heart rate variability. So in general, the type of evidence we might be interested in from our background and our training wasn't always there. And that means there's more work to be done. And this is the theme I'll come back to, is perhaps we're the people to do some of this work. What we did conclude in that review was there's a potential for nature-based interventions to be low stigma. That's kind of interesting. Mental health stigma is still there, despite all the wealth of discourse during COVID times. So mental health stigma is that stereotype and barrier we have both to seeking help ourselves, or a bias we have against those who seek help for mental health issues. Also, nature-based interventions can be non-invasive. They can sometimes be low cost and efficient, and they offer an alternative to some other more structured possibilities or treatments that can be used. They can be used, for example, in our project, almost citywide, so as public health interventions. And that gives us a lot of hope, because within sports psychology, we have a capacity to engage with people who are highly motivated, many of whom have training venues in natural environments, who could access nature, and who through either a structured or a naturalistic intervention can enhance their well-being. And that's as important for athletes as it is for us as practitioners in terms of self-care. So just to highlight this term I mentioned earlier, a walk in the park. So this green and blue exercise term is very important. It's where the bulk of the research has been focused. And at the same time, Ian Lahart, a colleague of mine, who worked on a previous project, Go Green X, conducted a systematic review, and the results were not in any way overwhelming, and to be honest, there were only tentative support for green exercise. And that's really important because what we know that from general population studies, it's hard to control for lots of variables. But within sport, we have people who are already motivated to exercise for the function of training, for the function of rehab, and potentially for the function of recovery. So this gives us a further reason to be talking about sport. So there's a recent study based in a beautiful area of Barcelona which shows substantive, significant changes from just a blue space intervention along the coast in Barcelona versus an indoor walk. And that's from Blue Health 2020, a predecessor Horizon project to our work. So there is hope in terms of the methodological sophistication. So this is a little bit complicated, so I want you just to hone in on one or two areas. But in general, there are multiple potential benefits from nature-based interventions, which go well beyond those hypothesized by the two traditional theories, stress reduction and attention restoration. What is also interesting is one must consider adverse effects. So I'll just give two examples. So there's research evidence that shows if you go to Hyde Park in London for physical activity and you have any underlying respiratory condition, for example, asthma, or in a more profound case, COPD, it's likely because of the ambient air pollution in that part of London that it will have detrimental health consequences for you. So it's really important, if we choose a green or blue natural environment, we ensure it's low in terms of the co-hazards of noise and air pollution. The other example I could give is pollen. So allergies to pollen are common. Urban trees are often of a type to be heat resilient, so they shed their bark a lot, which protects them, but this leads to high pollen counts. And this is an area which can lead to health issues for many people. So it's important to consider some of the potential risks. Also in terms of sport injury, if you go on a hiking trail the day before a major sporting event, it's probably not the best idea in the world because, you know, that lack of stability in the environment, those challenges, could be good in the transition phase of the year, but perhaps not best served in the competition phase. So how do we turn this into practice? Well, we know that being active in natural settings can be good. We know that athletes and coaches, if it's part of the program, this can be adapted and built in. This can add to social cohesion. It can add to a collective self-efficacy, so it can enhance the teamship. Coaches and support staff can model this behavior, as can psychologists, by doing it themselves. This is important in overcoming barriers or perceived barriers to participation in green exercise. To reduce physical workload, the RPE could be lower. So this could be done at low to moderate physical exertion, so low RPE. And this is quite interesting because this is not such a threat in terms of the workload which is monitored for many elite athletes. And again, it's important to be aware of unintended consequences. So this could be slowly built into a program over time. And one of the things it's probably worth assessing, and I'll come back to it in a case study in a moment, is people's preference for different natural environments. So do people prefer forests, canopy cover? Do they want open parks? Do they want to be by the water? What is their preference? And it's important in terms of autonomy that we build that into any interventions we support. I just want to give you one example that from our work and it's what we call the digital and non-digital nature experience. So this is a video from Go Green Roots from our team in Norway, where I'm a visiting researcher at INN, and the team have developed over about 2 years essentially a digital recreation of a built environment, using open street maps to create the built environment. And what they've been able to do is add natural features to create a surreal natural environment. In the latest version, there's a gamification element in which you can either chase a bird or try catch a butterfly. And what this shows is, as you'll see later, is that nature in its most authentic form is really powerful and interesting for us, but there is a digital side to it as well. And we use this to show the contrast between a built environment with and without nature. And that's something we're working on as a tool to increase nature connectedness. So you could have digital imagery, as many of you do, of your experience of nature. You could have perhaps some stories or journaling to remind you of a previous experience in nature. You could look back at these images, a psychological processing we know is savoring, and that will help rebound some of those positive emotions you will have experienced previously. And that's, quite a well-supported intervention, savoring. And virtual and digital experiences can augment or support non-digital, or we might term authentic nature, rather than replace. So in a paper a number of years ago, we created a model and we tried to show the hypothesized effects for non-digital nature, authentic nature, were likely to be higher than either digital on-screen versus digital virtual nature. So immersive virtual nature with VR goggles has also some unintended consequences. People get cyber sickness sometimes, but it's highly immersive. And in our study, when it's possible for people, as their body moves, for them to move through the digital environment. So this is something we're working on, but it tells you there are future scenarios we're thinking of here. Just to highlight the concept of nature as a co-therapist. So in this scenario, nature can be integrated into the intervention. What that means, you can explore the flowers, you can walk barefoot, you can look at the tree canopy, you can engage in different techniques. It could be mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques. So it does offer this foreground approach, but also offers a background approach. And I'll highlight briefly one of the background approaches. But nature as a therapy is actually increasingly accepted across Europe, for example. So much so, the BPS during COVID created a set of guidelines for practitioners to use to do outdoor therapy, i.e. with nature as a backdrop. What's really interesting is we have the opportunity to develop such guidelines for our practice to support work when we take athletes to nature. So I'm just going to give a brief glimpse into what that could mean. So these are a number of case studies based on experiences I've had with athletes. So when I worked in professional rugby, the term mindfulness was not perhaps within the lexicon of the athlete group. It wasn't something they would easily buy into. But if you went for a walk down by the river in this area here in Limerick, and they're suddenly focused on birdsong, the sound of the river, they end up engaging in activities which take them onto the mindfulness spectrum without explicitly doing so. So you've potential to change people's perception of their monitoring of their attention, their perception of their self, and their psychological recovery quite quickly. What's interesting for me about this is after doing this, and I too felt many benefits from it, I wasn't sure if it was the intervention, the therapeutic alliance, or the natural setting that was having the most effect. So that was very much a learning point for me. If I give another quick example, nature can be used for reflection. So many teams, after a match, to decompress, go to nature, swim in the ocean, swim in a pool, do something to help them engage in what organizational psychologists called a boundary between one event and another. So this boundary can help with recovery by establishing an endpoint, for example, for the match or the sport activity. Let me just give one other example. This is from an athlete I worked with. He used the nature scenes from the world's #1 mental health app called Calm. And this helped him regulate his emotions, both for training and match scenarios. And this is really interesting. The athlete was already using this when he started to work with me. So these just give a hint at a number of the possibilities, and we'll explore some more of those with you tomorrow if you want to join both Violetta Oblinger-Peters and Alan Scarry with me on a workshop to tell your nature story. Now, ultimately, there are many other issues in the planet right now. Athletes sometimes would say to me, we're in a bubble. We don't see what else is going around. Well, they're not living under rocks. So they're aware of the changing demographic in Europe as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. They're a result of the food crisis in many countries. They're aware of economic threats at the moment. They're aware of climate threats. They're aware of sustainability crises, the biodiversity crisis across the planet. So these global challenges are actually much more within the mind of athletes than we might give them credit for. And that gives us an interesting opportunity to work with them. So I'm going to highlight, to finish, just a number of research questions we could ask. So we could ask how practitioners already apply nature-based interventions. How do they do that? And just for their own self-care and to deal with work strain. We could look at any possible ethical issues we get from going to nature where we don't have this formal boundaries established, like we might in a sit-down consult in our own rooms or our office. We could use surveys to establish and focus groups to establish athletes' use of nature, their nature connectedness, and their views on sustainability, for example. Even something like eco-anxiety, which is very much voiced by young people. Athletes are young people too. They're within that age cohort, 14 to 24, which are at high risk of mental health issues. And we could look at athletes' perceptions of natural environments. What's their preferred areas for decompression, for pre-performance routines to relax? And then in terms of actions, there are a number of actions we can look at. So firstly, we can look at what is best practice. Let's try to develop best practice guidelines and educational tools so the next generation of sports psychologists don't have to change their label like I did to become an environmental psychologist to learn about this domain. This domain has many lessons and tools for all of us. We can look at evidence-based education platforms, additional CPD for others, and try establish together through co-creation new ways of thinking and doing. Because one lesson I've got from this Congress so far is we're not there yet, but we can get there together. And just to finish, what I'd like to do is just highlight we should always just remember we're on this planet. We are coexisting with nature, we should bring ourselves down to earth. We should stay grounded, no matter how laudable our Olympic and other goals. And just to finish, if we bring nature into our work and into our lives, there's a win for us, a win for our clients, a win for the environment, and a win for our planet. And that's the most important thing of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ted. That was an eye-opening talk. Before we go for the QR question round, I have two announcements from the organizers. The European Network of Young Specialists in Sports Psychology, please meet later in the Amsterdam Park. You will find it on Google Map, I hope. Second, the organizers also asked us, if you go down only half of the stairs on the right side, there will be the coffee and sweets, so bring them down to the posters if you want them, yeah, or drink them there, up to you. Now we can open the round of questions to Ted. Please raise your hand if you have, and there's a microphone, and there's one, there's two, three, and then we will see.
Thank you for this wonderful talk on such an amazing topic. I was wondering if nature-based intervention are always and in every sense positive or come with benefits, or if there are potential negative side effects at some point, or things we should at least need to consider as allergies and so on.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, because coming at this from a psychology perspective is different than many of the practitioners who work using nature-based interventions every day. So I guess we're more risk-averse than those trained in ecology, and there are many different types of practitioners in the field. And I think it's really important, if we're going to advocate the use of this in a more widespread way with athletes who already have a high degree of resilience, but at the same time are certainly periodically quite vulnerable, it's really dramatically important that we assess potential risks. And I'll just give you one example. In some interventions, they involve digital and non-digital nature. So you might go to nature and take out your phone to try capture a scene to savor it later. But for some people, taking out the phone almost diminishes the state in which they're in. It perhaps stops the mind wandering immediately. And this is something we want to unravel a little further, to know that if we're using technology sometimes to assist or complement a nature-based intervention, that we do this in a way which is complementary to a positive outcome. So your point is well made. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this topic. I find it fascinating, and I'm curious about those who grew up in an urban setting. Do we believe that this is kind of intuitive and very instinctual, or is it something that can be learned?
It's hard to answer that question right now, but we have a study which is looking specifically at urban nature connectedness. So you grow up in a city where you don't have access to high level of biodiversity, you've got degraded natural experiences. One of my PhD students, Cassie Murphy, is developing a scale to measure this. And I think one thing we can be sure is that the experience I had growing up in and on a river, often in it at the wrong time, walking across farmlands and fields, is very different in terms of nature connectedness than somebody who was an urban dweller until their adulthood. And we know those are qualitatively different exposures to nature and quantitatively. So I think we need to find tools to understand that. Because I think what you're suggesting is if we could perhaps foster nature connectedness amongst people who grew up in an urban environment, and that could lead to perhaps amplified benefits for them. Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering, you brought out different benefits that come from the nature-based interventions. Is there any research on what are the mechanisms behind cognitive ability? Because you brought out that too, which is really interesting. Like, what is the connection there?
So probably the best review paper suggested there are 15 potential mechanisms from nature-based interventions. The two traditional studies, one focuses on cognition. Attention restoration relies upon almost a William James type model. So we're working with researchers in neuroscience on what is the role of nature-based stimuli in promoting mind-wandering behavior. So I would say we're trying to shed light on new ways to explore this. And I think neuroscientific tools and experimental design will be just one of the ways that we'll be able to illuminate that topic.
Ted, wonderful. Thanks very much. And we have a gift for you. I'm happy to present. It's heavy. Thanks very much again for Ted, please. Thank you. Have a great poster session. Here's your. Thank you.